I'm here with Scott Murray, President and CEO of Murray Media, longtime friend, news anchor, sportscaster, and he's going to share a little bit of information for you quick, but then we're going to start with Eric Fanning and Meredith Walker of XPrize. He'll introduce her, and with that, Scott, take it away.
Thank you, my friend. Appreciate it. All right, David, what we want to do first of all, excuse me, is, got the frog in the throat here today. All our wonderful sponsors, Raytheon, Bell, NCI, City of Frisco, Valiant Defense Systems, National Security Innovation Network, all these wonderful people, Cohesity, Viasat, we thank them all because, as we have said before, without them, we would not be here. So thank you again for your generosity and for being a part of what we think is a very, very, very special team with America's Future Series. As David mentioned, Meredith Walker. Gosh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Meredith Walker and Eric Fanning will be along very shortly. But in the meantime, we do want to remind you that Sir Richard Branson and Dan Hart coming up, in about 45 minutes or thereabouts. The first of our two roundtables, Civil and Society, and then roundtable number 2, Military and Security, and then a fireside chat with Zaire Ali and Tim Ellis on relatively space. And then we look forward, of course, to your involvement with our Q&A, and that is coming up a little later on. So that's what we've got coming up, but we're excited about what's unfolding today.
That's right. So let's bring Meredith on, if we could.
You want to do that right now?
That'd be great.
All right. Meredith Walker is a global economist, and she is head of prize advancement with XPrize. She is also the co-chair of the America's Future Series Advisory Board, and of course, that's her most important job day to day, right? That's where you say, yes, David, it is. I'm there 24/7 making it happen, right? Hello, my friend. How you doing? David and I say welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, David. We're delighted to have the first America's Future Series Space Innovation Roundtable here today. I look like I'm speaking to you from the Orion Nebula, as you will see behind me. That is a Hubble telescope photo. The 30th anniversary was celebrated this summer, but I'm actually speaking to you from Dallas, Texas. If you hear dogs, please excuse the barking, but we Texans have to have a few. So I have the pleasure of serving as global economist and head of prize advancement at the XPrize Foundation, headquartered in Los Angeles, and I am here in Dallas. If you haven't heard of XPrize, our foundation is the reason we have private space industry here today. Back in 2004, we awarded the $10 million Ansari XPrize, and that is what this video will show you, and then I will pick back up from there. Could you please start the video?
I remember October 4th, 2004 really well.
It was a historic day. Virgin at quite a late stage had sponsored the project, so we were very excited.
It was a fascinating time. We had a very aggressive goal, and we didn't have much money.
3, 2, 1, release.
I created the Ansari XPrize because I've wanted to go into space since my childhood. I grew up in the 60s expecting that what I saw with NASA was going to continue and we were going to all have a chance to go into space.
My interest in space started when I was a young girl growing up in Iran. I felt like all the answers to every question I would have is out there.
As we explore frontiers, it's during those times that we create the greatest innovation ever.
Choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Any 8-year-old kid could tell you in 1962 what the purpose of the Apollo program was: to beat the Russians.
Ultimately, it didn't continue, and we didn't all have that ticket to the moon or Mars. So I asked myself, how am I ever going to realize my dream of going into space? Then I read one day that Lindbergh actually crossed the Atlantic in 1927 to win a $25,000 prize to try and make his dream of flight between New York and Paris happen in creating today's $300 billion aviation industry. So I said, wow, what a powerful mechanism. I can use that to make my dreams come true, which was opening up space. we are announcing here today the $10 million contest to privately build a spaceship.
The Ansari XPrize was the first XPrize that the foundation did. It was a $10 million prize for the first privately built spaceship to go to space twice within 2 weeks.
26 teams from 7 countries are in pursuit of the Ansari XPrize.
26 teams from around the world joined the competition, and it became clear very quickly that a company called Scale Composites, run by Burt Rutan, was going to be the front runner.
We developed from scratch a manned space program with Paul Allen's money, no other funding. I had to take a big risk to do it, but I did because the result would be huge. It was a covert program, so I couldn't go out and get help here and there. Couldn't afford to do wind tunnel testing. I was the airfoil designer on it. Usually you go someone else to get airfoils. We did 7 rocket firings, and 3 of those were flights out of the atmosphere. I did a very large percentage of all the detail design. But I think the most important element on Spaceship One is the feathered reentry. You can re-enter upside down and eat lunch while it straightens itself out. So it was a very aggressive build-up to open up the envelope.
I didn't sleep the night before. I was nervous, praying, God, please let them have a safe flight.
We're live here at the Mojave Airport on the ground, but as you can see, airborne is White Knight and Spaceship One.
2, 1, ready. Release. Arm. Fire.
First launched, Mike came back and says, "It flies like a dream." You know, that just struck me because it was an enormous load off of my shoulders.
Radar 328. Copy that. Wow, you would not believe the view.
A successful flight for Spaceship
They won a
and the privately
$10
built
million
Spaceship One
prize.
spacecraft rocketed XPrize.
The legacy of XPrize is to make dreams come true, to make impossible dreams come true.
Space will be a big part of humanity. I think the future will look very bright.
We're living in a day and age where small teams of individuals can literally do what only governments and large corporations could do before.
I just love the idea of XPrize. I mean, it spurs on innovations in a whole lot of different fields. If it hadn't been for the XPrize, we wouldn't be standing here today.
26 teams spent $100 million competing for that prize, and in doing so opened up a $1 billion market.
We're looking at billions of dollars already invested in the new private space industry, a future which includes space tourism, mining the moon, and maybe a dozen other industries we haven't yet thought of. The most critical tool for solving humanity's grand challenges, it isn't technology, it isn't money, it's only one thing. It's the committed, passionate human mind.
Hello, Meredith.
Yes, so thank you. So that is what XPrize started. Return to space, working with governments, private space companies, and others. And I would like to add, what the video didn't show was how closely XPrize had to work with the US government and the FAA and others to change the laws, really to open up space to allow for this type of rocket tests and things like this. We have continued with a couple of other prizes related to space. One was sponsored by Northrop Grumman, another sponsored by Google. So if you followed SpaceIL, the Israeli group last year, that is also a result of XPrize. And we continue it in not only space, but also ocean exploration, environment, and I would say most importantly, human equity. One of our core principles is not only the technology, but the inclusive innovators that we bring together from around the world to solve these grand challenges. I believe Secretary Eric Fanning has joined us, so fantastic. I will begin my introduction now. Thank you very much. So in preparation to introduce Secretary Fanning, who I've been told I must call Eric once we get into dialogue, although that will be very difficult for me, I had the pleasure of listening to General Mark Milley's speech about him when on his last day as Secretary of the Army. I cannot replicate the general's good-natured, marvelous humor, but what I would like to quote are a few of the key points he made about Secretary Fanning, so that you will know just how truly privileged we are to hear from him today on Space Force, an economic and national security imperative. General Milley said this is a man who cares deeply about soldiers and families, the most talented executive leader who was the right choice for the Army in critical times, who made tough resourcing decisions. But most importantly, he made us a better Army by setting an example of compassion, competence, and courage. Although he is now CEO of the Aerospace Industry Association, Eric Fanning was appointed the 22nd Secretary of the Army by President Obama on May 18, 2016, after, I might add, a unanimous Senate confirmation. During his tenure, Secretary Fanning believed that the most important role was to support the men and women who serve. He led the Army's transformation to a more inclusive force with a vision of ensuring that all of the nation's best and brightest have an opportunity to serve in their country. Now, just when we think back to the first folks on the moon and the pictures we got back from space, those pictures that changed our perceptions, our perspective of space and life on Earth, I would say Secretary Fanning has a very unique perspective, having served in the Air Force, also with Army, Navy, all three branches, which is unusual, also DOD. And having that perspective, plus the private sector, government perspective, civilian, and then also he grew up around a military family. 3 of his uncles served in the military. 2 of them are West Point graduates. One of those uncles was actually responsible for changing the way West Point did admissions and bringing that towards more in line with the Ivy Leagues. And I know that was a very memorable experience for Eric as a young boy, seeing how his uncle led such a transformation. And I would say that those lessons have been with him through today, and I'm just very delighted and truly honored to speak with him. Eric?
Oh, thank you for having me. And just one thing, a unanimous confirmation doesn't mean what people think it does. It was unanimous, but it was 2-0. There were only 2 senators on the floor at the time the nomination came up, and they were both Republicans. So I'd like to say I was a Democratic appointee who didn't get 1 Democratic vote for my confirmation. But the confirmation process is a strange one, and stranger by the day.
Yes, well, thank you for enduring it and being here with us today. So I'd like to lead off with your perspectives on why we need a Space Force now. Why is space such an important domain? Why do we need a new service for the first time since 1947?
Well, it's actually an idea that's been popping around for a pretty long time. It had bipartisan support, bipartisan opposition for a long time. It really grew out of the House side. The House would put it in the bill. The Senate would take it out of the bill. But the reason it eventually came around, I think there are a number of reasons. First of all, an increasing awareness of how important space is. The fact that our adversaries are catching up to us because they've watched and learned from us, which is the normal course of history in the military sense. And they're starting to pace us. Our competitive advantage militarily is declining. And there are probably a couple of reasons, or 3 reasons, I think, for that inside the Department of Defense, which gave life to the idea of creating a new force. One is the prioritization of spending. Space is inside the Air Force, and for many years, the perception, which I think was also reality, is that it was a bill payer for other priorities inside the Air Force. And so let's carve out the space budget and protect it. Second reason is we need to make sure we're building the right workforce, both in and out of uniform, for the Space Force, and that was harder to do inside the larger Air Force. And third is this is a place, all places, we've got to get our acquisition process and system to be more agile and to be faster, but that's particularly true in space. because the adversaries are catching up with us and are being very innovative and creative, and because we didn't really build the architecture up there to be resilient, much like when the internet was first built, it was open. We didn't think about how it could be used against us. And so part of the strategy for a resilient space and from a military perspective is be able to get things up there quickly. And so eventually Space Force came to be, and part of the opposition was, someone once said, you know, if you think that China and Russia and other countries are coming after you, why would you respond by entering a 10-year bureaucratic exercise of starting a big new service? But the Department of Defense, the Air Force, and now Space Force seem to be doing all the right things to not take just the model that exists. I mean, the youngest service in the military up until now is still 70 years old. They're really imagining, what do we need to do that's specific for this domain, and what can we take advantage of by building a new force in 2020?
Yes, I'm thinking on your point on the adversaries, China and Russia. A couple of years ago, I got to tour SpaceX privately with Buzz Aldrin. And you can imagine he was walking the floor and these young engineers were just so excited to see him. He was wearing his Return to Mars t-shirt with suspenders. But what got him most interested in touring SpaceX was actually the spacesuits that they were designing for the new Dragon and things coming up. And that really hit me hard, that it is our people that is our most important asset. And so I'd like to turn to a discussion of what the Space Force will look like from a human perspective. So with the stand-up of Space Force, the US has a unique opportunity to change what a military service looks like, as I've heard you speak on a 21st century force, so to speak, and also how it innovates. So what opportunities do you see for Space Force to immediately seize?
Well, there's a lot of competition for talent out there. You know, certainly in my world, the aerospace world, they're competing across industries and in the larger tech ecosystem for talent, but that's true with the military as well. And it's something that we have studied and looked at as we stood up cyber forces and cyber command. You know, we get these young people, we give them exquisite training, and they become very attractive targets to the private sector, who can perhaps give them a career that's more in line with what they want. And so what's interesting about Space Force to me is, in theory, you have a force where nobody in uniform will be directly in harm's way, unlike the other services. I mean, this isn't a Marine Corps in space. This is command and control of our assets in space, ground stations, making sure we get the data and use it appropriately. That gives you more flexibility in two ways. One is who comes into Space Force. Right from the start, about 70% of 18-year-olds in this country aren't eligible for military service, primarily for educational reasons, physical fitness, and criminal records, which is mostly drugs and frankly mostly marijuana, which is a whole nother issue that I think the military has got to grapple with as laws on marijuana change. This is an opportunity to reimagine what the standards would be for service in the Space Force, particularly when it comes to physical fitness. And it's not a lowering of standards. It is an actual re-baselining of what does someone need to serve in the Space Force and what is an unnecessary barrier to entry. So it could expand opportunities for more Americans to serve in the military, which is good for the military. It's good for the country to have more of an overlap in that regard and have more people understand what military service is. And then once in the service, there are things we can change as well and provide more career opportunities, more developmental opportunities that are harder to do in the other services. You know, people entering in the middle of their career, people leaving for a while to get experience on the outside and then coming back in and bringing that experience inside. Fewer moves. It should be easier to concentrate where Space Force is. And the movement of people in uniform in the military is very disruptive for a spouse who has a career, for kids who are in schools. And so this could be an opportunity to provide more stability for the family too. So all these things taken together should make it easier to recruit and retain the workforce that we're training.
Thinking about the workforce, in the video I showed of XPrize, our CEO, Anusha Ansari, although she funded the first XPrize, shortly thereafter, she got to spend, about a year later, she spent 11 days on the International Space Station. She spent over a year training in Russia to be able to go up and do that. And she describes seeing from space what that was like and thinking of us all as Earthlings. And she had that dream as a young girl in Iran. She grew up watching Star Trek, and she drew a photo of herself going to space at like age 6. And fortunately, nobody laughed at her at that time. She was able to keep that dream and unbelievably make it come true. And so listening to you speak about the type of workforce we would need for Space Force, the rethinking of standards, I believe that opens up, as you just said, the military type of service career to a whole other group of minds that could really benefit our military and also future innovation. So let's talk about diversity and inclusion. Where does diversity and inclusion fit in? General Raymond, the Chief of Space Operations, has said that it will be woven into the service's DNA. How does a service really make that happen?
So again, being able to open up opportunities for more Americans to serve will help with that. And that's a real opportunity for Space Force. I mean, we know, government knows, the Pentagon knows, industry knows, we know that diverse teams come up with more creative solutions. And so not only is it the right thing to do to provide opportunities and knock down arbitrary barriers to service, it's going to lead to better results, better teams, a stronger Space Force. And that's an opportunity that a lot of us have been focused on from the jump when it comes to Space Force. But to see General Raymond talk about wanting to make it a part of Space Force from the start means that not only are you going to be able to attract more of the best and brightest that the country has to offer, I think it will help with retention, but it's going to make Space Force, anyone looking to come into the military, I think a very attractive option, because they're going to see that more types of people have options for leadership in Space Force than they might have in other parts of the military. Absolutely. You mentioned, I just want to say, you mentioned seeing the Earth from space. I mean, what's interesting too, you know, you've got commercial space, civil space exploration, NASA, and military, and they all overlap. The workforce overlaps, some common needs overlap. I see someone has put in the chat box about space junk. I mean, we have a lot of debris in space from countries that made bad decisions, from accidents, what have you. And it's dangerous, obviously, and it's in everyone's interest, all those domains, every country's interest to try and mitigate the spread, the increase of junk, but also find ways to bring it out. It also is, you know, space in any part of it, even the military part, is a wonderful opportunity for global partnerships. And we see it with NASA's exploration. We certainly see it in commercial space. These are supply chains and markets that are global. And in military space too, with tremendous global partnership and alliances that are a part of all of these efforts, recognizing the importance to national security, but also to economic security.
Absolutely. Yes. Thinking of Secretary Gordon England saying economics and national security are two sides of the same coin. And as a global economist, I certainly believe that. And it's not only for national security, for international security. And as space shows, more than any other domain, we really are on this planet all in it together. So Space Force is intended to be much smaller service than the others, with initial estimates around 16,000. Focus will be solely on space, leaving non-mission functions to the Air Force. So how would this lean, mission-focused service create an identity and protect its interests amongst its larger counterparts? And then also when the domain is shared by so many different countries, and what advantages would this size and mission offer?
Well, culture is key, of course, to almost any endeavor and any enterprise. And I think you're already seeing a culture develop in Space Force. It's being built primarily with people from the Air Force, but from all the services who are transferring in, who have chosen to take part in the creation of this new service. And I think you'll see a culture develop around that pretty quickly. And a part of that will be that it is new, and it's the first service in 70 years. And, before that, the Navy, the Army, and the Marine Corps go back really to the founding of the country. And so right there, it's an opportunity that's almost inescapable to create a unique and interesting culture. And that's a part to watch. What would you do differently? You don't necessarily take the model of a previous service and just check all the boxes, what's your uniform, what's your flag, what's your emblem, and so forth, but to really think about what's different about the service. And the nice thing, I think the small size of it was one of the things that had some people opposed to creating it. They didn't think this is big enough. I mean, the Marine Corps was the smallest service, and Space Force is less than a tenth the size of the Marine Corps. But it's one of the advantages, because all these things we were talking about earlier, all these things where you can experiment with doing something new, you can do it in a smaller organization, which allows you to model it, pilot it, test it, and if it works, then you can scale it. And so you're building something from scratch. It's smaller size. It allows you, I think, more flexibility, more freedom to get creative about how you model it. There are all these things I mentioned at the start of the call, lateral accessions, coming in the middle of your career, coming in, going out, having part of your career in the military, part of your career in the civilian side. These have been discussed for a very long time. It's harder to do in an established, larger service, especially where people are going into harm's way. And so the Space Force combines all these things that allow an opportunity here to really try some of these things and reimagine what service is like in the 21st century.
Eric, I think that's one of the things I really admire about your career path, is that you've been able to enter into bureaucracies, so to speak, and disrupt them, but in a positive way, without it seems like the support you got from the Army, especially even though you were there such a short time as secretary, was just beautiful and astounding. I know that you traveled to, I think, what was 31 different countries out visiting. Let me see perhaps tell us again the exact number. I know as soon as you became secretary, you made a big point to travel out around the world and around this country visiting our people.
Well, just the Army alone has soldiers in 140, 150 countries. I certainly didn't get to all of them. I don't remember exactly how many I visited during the Army time versus Air Force, Navy, DOD larger sense, but it was over 80 countries in all, because we are deployed. And for a lot of people around the country, that's their exposure to Americans is, young soldier, sailor, airman, Marine who are deployed around the globe.
Yes, and they are, the folks deployed around the globe really are our American ambassadors. Could you talk a moment about the American leadership that our military shows around the world in that capacity?
Well, I think this is economic and national security leaderships, but on the military side, we talk about adversaries. The difference between the United States, Russia, and China is we have friends. And these are complicated relationships. They ebb and they flow. Sometimes they're stronger than other times based on leadership on either side. But we have partners and allies and friends. Russia and China have what they buy or what they bully. And that's an underappreciated asset to this, to our country. And we couldn't do what we do without those partnerships. And so whether it's in commercial space, civil space, Artemis is already a combination of countries in that effort, or in national security space. We do it together with our allies, and that's one of the things that gives us a tremendous technological advantage. And we want the United States to maintain that leadership. That is good for our national security and good for our economic security to stay out front of that. And so when you're thinking about protocols or regimes for how you behave in space, a number of countries just signed the Artemis Accords, I think, about how they're going to behave on the moon, or rules about space debris, or, as we are exploring more and more and further away, we want to make sure that the United States maintains a leadership in terms of bringing other countries together and coming up with some common norms and standards. If we don't do it, someone else will. And I'm more inclined to think, with all the foibles of the United States, that we're the ones that are going to do it best and most inclusively.
Oh, absolutely. I'm reminded of my great uncle, Major General Charles Bond, who served as an AVG Flying Tiger and then also as attaché to Avril Harriman. So he spent quite a bit of time in China and Russia. And not only does the U.S. have allies? I would also ask for your reaction. I believe that our military, we treat our own people better than any other military. If you see that film, the Korean film My Way, that tracks a Japanese Olympic runner who got Korean runner who was captured by the Japanese, forced to fight for them in World War II, then captured in Russia, forced to fight for them, and then ultimately was rescued by the Americans. What is so striking is those militaries shoot their own people, whereas the American military, we do our very best to bring people home, no matter how many decades have passed since they were lost. So moving from US leadership on our people and how we treat them on our industrial base, I'd like to ask. So the industrial base has proven itself incredibly innovative in the space area. And you've had a front row seat to watch that both in government and industry. But a frequent complaint is that innovation does not always transfer to the warfighters who need it most. So how would you assess the success of getting innovative solutions into the hands of the troops who need them? And how can space enterprise do this differently? And what lessons would they then be able to share with the rest of the defense community?
It has been a problem for the Department of Defense to bring interesting things from the innovation base, US and globally, into the department. And it's not for lack of exposure. Frankly, it's the acquisition system. The department sees something that it thinks is interesting and then sticks it into the traditional defense acquisition system, which is just too slow and too long. And companies can't survive that length of experience that it takes to get an order on scale for the health of the company and to get it to the warfighter. That's one of the very interesting things about Space Force, because it's smaller, because part of why it was founded was a recognition that we're not getting technology to the warfighter into space fast enough, either today or if we need to replace it in conflict. And so they are reimagining the acquisition process. And because it is a smaller force, I think they'll be given more latitude by Congress, because a lot of this is in statute, and by the department, because a lot of it's in regulation, to take on a little more risk and to experiment a little bit more with how you bring that innovation in from the outside. There's plenty of innovation in the defense industrial base. And as I said earlier, national security, civil, exploration and commercial overlap a lot. The issue is finding that right balance. There's going to be a lot from the commercial world that can contribute to our nation's security. There's going to be a lot that's going to have to be built in the national security, the defense industrial base, but we want to find ways to be faster and more agile in bringing the commercial side in. And hopefully the rest of the department can learn from that. That is acquisition reform is probably the thing that's studied and written about the most of anything when it comes to the Department of Defense. So the track record's not always great in terms of the big changes that need to be made, but whereas DoD used to drive technology, stealth, GPS, internet, it now has a hard time keeping up with the rapidly increasing pace of iterative technological change and advancement. And so we hopefully can learn from what Space Force does and then scale it and apply it to the rest of the Department of Defense.
Yes, that will be fantastic. I'm just thinking of all the presentations I've heard over the years about acquisition reform and the need for that. And I can imagine how the Space Force could really expedite that by providing a positive model of how it could be done. Thinking, you also served a time with BENS, Business Executives for National Security, and I'm reminded of that, maybe the commercial government relationships. Can you explain a little bit more what type of partnerships or collaborations could there be for Space Force between business and government?
Well, I think there's plenty of opportunities there. And part of that is, I said earlier, not just on the uniform side, but the civil service side, because I really hope they think about the civil service side differently too, and think about opportunities for civilians. What's the balance of who's in charge of what inside of that service that might look a little bit different than the other services, but the opportunity for people to flow in and out of Space Force, whether civilian or uniformed, is what's most exciting to me. That will build more partnerships. I've spent most of my life on the government side. I'm now working on the industry side. And I thought I knew a lot more about industry than I did. And had I known then what I know now, it would have helped me a great deal. And industry doesn't always understand their government partners either. There's very different incentives on both sides, which is good. It's fine. But I think more understanding, more cross-pollination would be good. I saw that certainly at Ben's, Business Executives for National Security, the idea that, the military is really designed to build warriors, who hopefully you don't have to use, but you're thinking about fighting and winning wars if all of your deterrence efforts don't work. Those aren't necessarily the same skills that you need to run one of the world's largest healthcare systems, one of the world's largest educational systems. I mean, there's, DoD is so big, it's got everything in it: commissary systems, exchanges, you name it, installations management. And so getting more experience like that from people in the industry side, outside of the military, is going to be really helpful. So hopefully we'll be able to do more of that. And you see it in little pieces now. I was on a call yesterday with the head of the Defense Innovation Unit, who used to be on the Ben's board of directors. He used to run Symantec, and now he's gone over to the government side to bring some of his experience about technology and how to field it and incorporate it onto the DoD side. And so I think the more opportunities we provide for people to learn about each side, the stronger we become overall.
Oh, absolutely. And just to expand a bit on your point regarding civil service and civil service opportunities, I've heard you speak on civilian control of the military. And I think for those people who worry that Space Force means we're going to have space wars immediately, could you speak a bit on the civilian control of the military and why that's constitutional and so important?
Well, it is one of the things I think that makes our nation strong. I mean, the military is apolitical. It's supposed to stay out of that part of our national debates. And a part of making sure that happens is civilian control of the military. And a lot of people don't understand that. I can't even begin to count the number of times when I would walk into a room and when I was Secretary of the Army or Acting Secretary of the Air Force, and they'd ask me why I wasn't wearing my uniform. And I kind of like the question because you got to explain what is important about civilian control, that it has to be the elected leaders of the country who are making the decision about how to use the military. That's a command and control aspect. That doesn't set our country apart, but it is an important part of what makes our country strong. And I think, you started the question talking about the civil service. I just do want to say we tend to focus on the people in uniform, but we have a remarkably important cadre of civilians in government too that are a critical, indispensable part of this. And a lot of the flexibility that I think would be important to get for Space Force is limited by law. So there's some legislative changes that would need to be made for these flexibility, but I think it will help us recruit that next generation into the government, because for a lot of people today, a lot of the younger people coming out of college or what have you, government service doesn't look all that attractive. We've got the mission, which we should be talking about more, but we need to find ways to make a career path for people that in government that's attractive and as flexible as the type of career path they have outside of government.
Yes, I'm thinking just how many new career paths are open for our young people today, and thinking back to when we were young and how exciting space would have seemed, or we would have never dreamed it possible that we might one day get to go. Just a quick aside, personal question, do you think you might ever want to go? We have Sir Richard Branson speaking shortly on how civilians might be going to space.
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. I'd go in a heartbeat. I mean, that was one of the fun things of being in the Navy Department, the Air Force Department, the Army Department. I used to try and, when I traveled, I'd say, just send me to where the 18-year-olds are being trained and let me do what they're doing, which may not have been the safest thing to do at all times. My bosses tried to rein me in sometimes, saying that's good for 18-year-olds, but you've outgrown that now. But I would go to space in a heartbeat.
Yes, if I'm thinking how age 100 needs to be the new 60, and so who's to say we can't go, right? So in the past decade, we've seen the space enterprise thriving with new entrants and exquisite technologies, bettering our global economy and everyday American way of life. How can the national security space sector learn from civil and commercial space and leverage that to advance the mission? And I would also say if there's an articulation of the Space Force mission that you could say here for us, that would be great.
So there's two things. I'll start with the mission. I mean, the assets that the military has are not just for national security. They really are for economic security and our everyday life as well. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like if we didn't have GPS right now? I wouldn't be able to get to the corner store. I'm so dependent on the apps on my phone. So these are not distinct aspects of this. They're commingled. And so we need to remember that space, it's much like the Navy keeping the sea lanes open so that we have global commerce and global trade. It's the same for Space Force. They are in charge of important command and control aspects for the military, so that we have situational awareness of what's happening in the battlefield. We have communications. There's the nuclear command and control aspect, which is separate altogether. But then there are a number of tools the military uses that are also open to the rest of us, again, like GPS, weather forecasting. And so the role of the Space Force is not just those military roles that I mentioned, but is also to help protect space for all these other ways that we use it, for commercial space, for civil space. And as more and more countries are able to go to space, making sure there's some order so that we don't end up with more space debris and just running into each other. So there's that mixed aspect there. And when you talked earlier in the start of the question about commercial, civil, and military, they all learn from each other. It's not as if commercial is built on a brand new physics that was created that's distinct from what got us to the moon or what have you. You know, there wasn't a commercial market when the United States decided to go to the moon. And so there wasn't that private investment. It took the United States government to say, we want to go to the moon. But the United States government didn't go alone. They turned to industry and hired industry to get us to the moon. And as we explored more and spent more time in space, both from the civil side and the military side, the commercial market grew. And it's a fast growing market that will easily get to $1 trillion, I think. So everybody wants to be a part of that. We obviously want the United States to maintain its edge because of the size of that market. And so it's not three distinct things. They're commingled. They share a supply chain, they share a workforce, and they are learning from each other. The biggest challenge, as we discussed earlier in this, in my mind, is the military side reorganizing, reforming so that it can take advantage of the fast iteration of technology that's taking place on the commercial industry side.
Meredith, yes, just wanted to let you know we have about 3 minutes left in the session.
Yes.
If we're willing to extend with Eric, of course, that'd be great. And there are 6 questions in the Q&A box as well.
Okay, I do see those questions. Thank you, Prescott. And I do have one final question from myself for Eric. And because space is the new domain, and we have few international treaties for space, as Army Secretary, you did travel the world and observed the largest joint exercise since the end of the Cold War, Anaconda 2016 in Poland, with 31,000 participants from 24 nations. Please also discuss the importance of alliances for space and what that might look like for Space Force.
Well, first, let me just say about Anaconda and traveling around the world. I said earlier there are 150 countries in which the Army is deployed, just the Army, not counting what the other services are. And one of the amazing things to see is no matter who was serving in the militaries of those countries, they could see themselves in the United States military because we're such a diverse country and because our military is so diverse. That's a very powerful thing, both in terms of just an aspirational aspect of the United States, but also in helping tighten those partnerships. The idea that we kind of represent all of the different militaries and countries we're working for, I found to be very powerful on the other country side. But the alliances are critical, again, not only because they set us apart from our adversaries, our competitors, but also because, just as we talked about diversity helping you get to better, more creative, innovative solutions, these alliances allow us to put more resources together to get to where we're going. And I was in the Air Force job, we were taking a lot of heat for relying on a Russian-made engine. And if you looked at it in the context of the 21st century and where we were in our relationship with Russia, sure, but that went all the way back to the end of the Cold War. And when the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall came down, we as a country said, space is a place where we can build a friendship and a partnership with this country, Russia, that's grown out of the Soviet Union or reemerged out of the Soviet Union. And so space is one of the wonderful opportunities for us, both all commercial, civil, and national security, to build partnerships, because there's so much left to explore and so much left to learn and so much more we can do there.
And it will take us working together to do that. I see one really fantastic question. There's several in the chat box I'm sorry I haven't gotten to, but this one, I've heard you speak on the Army Corps of Engineers. When it comes to Space Force, it's commonly held the majority of participants are part of the military akin to the Marines. But what will be the opportunities for freshly graduated aerospace engineers to work contracts with Space Force? I'm thinking, will we have a Space Force Corps of Engineers? Who knows?
Well, I don't know if we'll get to a Space Corps of Engineer. It's not really a part of the plan right now to be building outposts in space, which is again why I said you've got a service that in theory, no one's going to be directly in harm's way, which again is an interesting way to think about how things have changed in the 21st century. But the opportunities in space, national security side of space, are kind of endless for aerospace, recently graduated aerospace engineers. I mean, aerospace and defense, the industry, over 2 million workers hunt for talent and competing like everybody else. And so Space Force will be competing with aerospace and defense, which will be competing with, the technology sector. There are a lot of opportunities for engineers that graduate. I sit on the University of Michigan Engineering School Board of Advisors, and there is so much interest in everyone who graduates from that school, and it's true of all the schools that are out there. Aerospace is growing, and not just because of Space Force. I mean, think about urban air mobility, all the different things that we used to do on the ground that we are increasingly doing in the air and in space. So there's a lot of opportunity in the future for aerospace.
Yeah, I'm just thinking back to Buzz Aldrin on his own education background. Perhaps Space Force by default will be an entire force of aerospace engineers. One thing we were able to achieve through XPrize was working with the FAA. You would have thought that the type of pilot qualifications that you would need to fly what Sir Richard will be speaking to us about would be like just something extraordinary. And actually, they're pretty human standards that those pilots have to get to. So the point being, yeah, I do see the opportunities are really
well, yeah, and it's not just aerospace engineers either. I remember one trip when I was in the Air Force job, going to one of the satellite control stations bases, and it was a very young woman airman with only 3 stripes on her shoulder, so junior enlisted, who was literally in front of a bank of computers, on her shift flying the satellite for which she had control. I mean, I was afraid to touch any button on the screen. And so, the military takes very young people and gives them a lot of responsibility. And so it's not just engineers, and we do need more engineers, but it's a very robust set of needs we have in Space Force and in aerospace in general.
I think that follows into this, the final question I've received from the audience. There's been a discussion about recruiting a diverse and innovative workforce, and what can we do as a nation to better position America's youth to contribute to Space Force or elsewhere in the Defense Department? I think that was the beginning of the answer you just gave. So if you'd like
I think there's 2 things. Certainly one is better preparing the nation's youth. So when I said only 30% or so of 18 to 24-year-olds are eligible for service now, education is a big part of that. And so I would, I'm always advocating for strengthening our investment in education at all levels, particularly when it comes to STEM, because we know that the trajectory of STEM is a series of off-ramps. You tend to lose people out of STEM, when they go from elementary school to middle school to high school to college. I think, only 1 in 6 high school graduates is inclined and prepared to study STEM in college, and fewer than 50% who start STEM in college finish it. And so we need
all the engineer friends who ended up in finance, right?
Well, I started with STEM and I finished as history, so I'm the cautionary tale myself. But so I would say education. I mean, this country, that is an investment in the future of our country. And then on the military side, it's knocking down false barriers. I mean, all the different things that have been done over the last couple of decades to open up service to more Americans who meet the requirements, but were being kept out for reasons that had nothing to do with their ability to do the job. Opening up all remaining positions in the military to women, for example, the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Going back to Truman integrating the military after World War II. There's more of that we can do to make sure that Americans who want to serve and can contribute then can get in. And so it's pumping the pipeline with education, and then making sure that we're not setting arbitrary restrictions that keep people from serving who contribute to our nation's security.
Oh, that's beautifully said, Eric. Thank you very much. I truly agree that knocking down those false barriers. And thank you. We know you were the first openly gay Secretary of the Army, and leading in that capacity so that people can see themselves in positions of leadership. And I'm thinking back to the times for our Black friends in World War II who served, and I would say the military has led in a lot of ways on breaking down those false barriers for all to serve. And once again, the strength of our military is truly our people. So at America's Future series, we do talk about competitiveness from a business perspective, international technology, but at the core of it all, we believe America's strength is in our people and our values. So concluding thoughts from you, Eric, we would love to hear any.
Well, I say this all the time. Our military is strong. It's the strongest military I think the world has ever known, but it's not what is the strongest thing about our country. It is our ideals. And if we stay true to those and to our values, that's what people look to when they want to be our partners and our allies, because they aspire to what they see that we have. And that's what we should be leading with. And a part of that is the innovation that we see in space right now. It is very exciting for us. It's really exciting for people outside of the country.
Absolutely. Well, Secretary Fanning, thank you so very much for sharing your time and insights with us today. And we look forward to reading more of what you have to say on Space Force, and speaking again soon.
Great. Well, thanks for having me today, and good luck with the rest of the summit.
Thank you.